So, hi and welcome back. My talk this afternoon is Mind Reading in the Predictive Processing Framework. And I'm interested in social cognition. I'm interested in how it is that we interact with other members of our kind, how it is that we detect states of knowledge and belief and desire in other sentient beings around us. That kind of cognition has a lot in common with other types of cognition that we exercise with respect to inanimate nature in the world. So in particular, it shares with the rest of cognition a number of functions having to do with prediction and explanation. Imagine that you're playing a game of billiards with some friends, and you'll be doing usually a couple of different things. One of the things you're doing is watching the table and watching the balls collide with each other in ways that are relatively predictable, and you can even sort of strategically aim your shots in ways that take advantage of your knowledge of the regularities that you see as things that are inanimate collide on the table. Your folk physics, if you want. But another thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be watching the actions and interactions among the players around the table. And there'll be certain things that you expect them to do, things that you don't expect them to do. You will be taking advantage of your knowledge of certain regularities in the way people will be anticipated to behave. And one of the things you notice about people versus billiard balls is that while they act according to certain kinds of regularities, seems to be a bit more elasticity in the way that they follow those regularities. So you know that if two billiard balls collide, there'll be an immediate reaction of a certain very predictable type. But if a person acquires an item of knowledge or a belief or a desire, they say, become aware that you've sunk the cue ball into that far corner pocket. And they know that as a player, they now have the right to pull it out and place it anywhere they want to on the table to their own strategic advantage. You can expect that they will go for that cue ball, but you can't expect necessarily the precise moment and manner of their reaching for it, right? It seems a little bit elastic. They've gained that state of knowledge. You can expect them to act on it, but it might not be completely determinate, completely obvious, completely clear to you exactly the moment in which they'll act and the manner in which they'll act. Even if it's somewhat predictable, there is a greater degree of play in how agents versus inanimate objects follow the rules that we tend to attribute to them. I think there's two sides of mind reading in the literature. And by mind reading, I don't mean any kind of stage magical ability. I just mean our ordinary psychological capacity to attribute mental states to other sentient beings. So these are states of knowledge, belief, desire, goal states. We predict and understand the behavior of other agents in terms of those states. We see them as driven by an inner agenda in a way that we don't see inanimate objects like this pen. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have anything it perceives or anything it wants. It's not striving for anything. The people in this room are different. So one of the things that we do in mind reading is we do what we might call specifically agent-oriented mind reading. You look at the little agent, as it were, detached from the world, and you wonder, what is this frisky little agent going to do next, right? And in order to answer that question, you have to think, what does this agent believe? What do they want? Can we expect them to remain seated, or will we expect them to get up? If I yell fire, is everyone going to get up? Or are they going to understand that that was just an example so they don't have to move? We can just think of mind reading in terms of predicting what agents will do and explaining what agents have done. But there's another thing we can do and another side of mind reading that I want to highlight in today's lecture, which is what I'm going to call world-oriented mind reading. So I think, although we use mind reading to learn about agents, we also use mind reading to learn about the world. And very specifically, we learn a lot about the world by watching how knowledgeable agents react to it. So if you see someone else at a restaurant ordering a certain dish and then appearing sort of revulsed as they take a first bite of it, you're not going to want to order that. Just in sort of very low-level ways. To go back to the game of billiards. Suppose that Suppose that you turn away from the table at the moment that a ball was sunk. You might learn what had happened by watching one of the intelligent in-the-know players who you took to be watching the table during the moment that you were turned away. You might come to know what's going on the table by watching where they reach to get the ball that was presumably sunk in your absence. So other agents, smart creatures that they are, can serve as kind of cognitive proxies for us. We can watch them to figure out what's going on in the world around us. So that's world-oriented mind reading. And I think it plays a special function which intersects with my interests in epistemology. So as an epistemologist, I'm interested in both knowledge and belief. And I'm interested in the puzzle of why we attribute both states when we go around trying to explain and predict what agents will do. So think of Alice and Bob here. And suppose I just tell you that Alice thinks that there's cake in the basket, but Bob actually knows that there's cake in the basket. Maybe he packed this particular picnic basket and had immediate firsthand awareness of what was going in there. Alice just expects that there's cake, there usually is, or something like that. And I tell you that both Alice and Bob want cake. What are they going to do? They're going to do exactly the same thing. They're both going to reach into the basket. So it might seem like not obvious why we're attributing both of these states. It becomes more obvious when you stop just looking at Alice and Bob and you start looking at the world. I'm going to give you a choice between these two baskets. Alice believes that there's cake in this basket, and Bob knows that there's cake in that basket. Suppose that you want cake. It's a really easy choice. Which of these baskets is more desirable, right? This state of knowing is a state which can only attach to truths, right? It's a factive mental state. The state of believing is a state which, yeah, sometimes you believe it and it turns out that way, sometimes not. It's a little bit more dicey. So when we're just listening to other people's reports, one of the things that's very nice to have is this distinction. So if somebody gives you a report that uses that stronger factive locution, it means at least the reporter has bought into the truth of this embedded clause. So that's a nice signal to be able to send each other. But just thinking of this again from the selfish first-person perspective before communicative considerations come onto the scene. How am I going to know, or how am I going to take Bob to know that there's cake in the basket? It seems like in order for me to be entitled to use that description of what's going on with Bob, I have to already know the truth of the matter myself. I must already take it as true that there's cake in the basket. Maybe I was watching as Bob packed the basket, so I saw that there was cake there. Or maybe I packed the basket myself earlier and then I just showed Bob 5 minutes ago. So it seems like in order for me to use this stronger factive mental state predication, I already have to know the truth about where the cake is. But if I already have to know the truth about where the cake is, then as long as what I'm interested in the world is just basic level questions like where's the cake, it could look like I don't really need to use that strong factive mental state locution. It's kind of redundant. Me being entitled to use that locution already demands that I know whether the proposition that I'm talking about, that I'm attributing some mental attitude on the part of Bob towards this proposition, whether or not it's true. Because only if it's true can I use this stronger locution. However, this is where things start to get maybe a tiny bit more interesting. Sometimes I don't know whether or not this proposition is true. I don't know. There might be cake in the basket, there might not, as far as I'm concerned. But I can tell that Bob will know one way or the other. I can see Bob as having knowledge that I lack. I can see him as knowing whether there's cake in the basket. I can see him as knowing what is in the basket or where the cake is. So in addition to having these attributions of knowledge that, I can also attribute knowledge whether, knowledge where, knowledge when, any of those kinds of constructions where what I'm attributing to him is a superior epistemic position to mine on a question where he might know the answer to the question and I don't yet know it. And this happens naturally and in everyday contexts. And we'll see in a minute, actually even some non-human animals can do exactly that kind of mental state attribution. They can't see where the food has been placed, but they can tell that one of their competitors has an unobstructed line of sight into the baiting area, and they will use that item of knowledge, ooh, that guy knows where it is, in order to find out where the food is for themselves. So they can actually do this very clever thing. So the knowledge of other people can be a kind of key or clue to unseen parts of the world or unknown parts of the world more generally for us. We can look at other people. We can read their Yelp reviews of restaurants we haven't been to and take signals from them. So right now, this guy, let's call him Bill, is peering into the cupboard. I can't, from where I'm standing, see into this cupboard, but I can see that Bill can see, and I can say, hey, Bill, are there any coffee mugs in there? Because I see Bill as knowing what's in the cupboard, right? This is all very commonplace. But wait a minute. How can I tell that he knows what's in the cupboard? Because, you know, from where I'm standing, I'm just actually kind of conjecturing that he can see into the cupboard. There could be like a black velvet curtain obscuring the contents of the cupboard out of my line of sight, but obstructing his. Bill could be blind. Bill could be hallucinating. I'm looking at him. I say he knows what's in that cupboard. I'm kind of sticking my neck out to say that. And you might think a smarter thing to do would be for me to say, okay, technically, he likely has some beliefs about what's in that cupboard. And the beliefs are likely to be true. I mean, 99.99 times, or whatever. He's probably in a good epistemic position with respect to these contents. I don't tend to do that. I tend to do the much simpler thing of saying, of seeing him as knowing. And it's interesting that I do that. And it's kind of a normative question. Am I entitled to do that? Or should I instead be attributing to this guy some kind of credence state or some kind of state which has a relatively high likelihood of representing reality? Maybe that would be the smarter thing to do. That is a smarter thing to do with Yelp reviews, by the way. I'm not taking totally for granted. But in this kind of situation, do we gain anything from seeing this guy as actually knowing what's there versus just thinking, okay, he's a signal which has a certain predictive validity, maybe not 100%. I'm going to try to argue that, yes, we do gain something from seeing this guy as knowing. And I'm going to try to explain what that is and explain why. Here's just a quick outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about using other people as a guide to reality. I'm going to talk in a very thumbnail-y way about predictive processing, talk about why we're going all the way to states of knowledge, and whether those states are actually real. So starting with using other people as a guide to reality. So I don't know how it is in Estonia. I think your highways are pretty flat, so you may not do this, but in rural Canada, you get out in the provinces, and the highways have a lot of sort of hills and valleys. You're driving along, and often you'll see the cars like up on the hill in front of you. Suddenly they all slam on their brake lights. And that's a sign, at least in Canada, that, oh, there could be a speed trap at the bottom of the next valley, because our police like to position themselves where you're not going to see them coming. And so you read that as a signal when you see everybody ahead of you pushing on their brakes, like, okay, I'm going to slow down now too. And you're not just slowing down because like you're kind of afraid of hitting them, right? You immediately have that thought, oh, there's trouble ahead. And it seems like one of the things I'm doing there is I'm taking the intelligent action of other perceiving agents as some kind of signal of what's going on in the larger reality beyond what I can immediately see. Now you might wonder whether there's really mind reading going on here. Like, am I actually looking at those cars as containing like little guys who know something? Or am I doing something that's actually structurally simpler? And yeah, you do this all the time. So, you know, you're looking out the window and you see the tops of the trees moving really hard. Because you're about to leave, you're wondering, should I take an umbrella or will it just be blown inside out by the wind? Is it windy outside? And you look at the motion of the trees, which actually you don't really care about. You're not going to enter. It's not like you're planning on going and like playing in the treetops or anything like that. What you care about is the wind, and you see the motion of the trees just as a signal of the wind, and it's not because you're seeing the trees as somehow sentient and knowing that the wind is blowing or something like that. Just that you have a very clear established correlation between the visible phenomenon of the trees moving and the phenomenon that you actually care about, which is the wind blowing. One of the signs that there is actually mind reading going on in this kind of case would be if we're somehow sensitive to the presence or absence of knowledge. If we follow cues in other agents' behavior differentially, depending on whether we have prior reason to see them as knowledgeable or ignorant. And there's, in fact, lots of experimental evidence that we do that, and even other animals do that. But it's not very easy to establish that there's genuine mind reading going on, as opposed to some lower, shallow, surface level phenomenon. So this bird right here is called the northern bald ibis. And one thing I can tell you about this bird is that it's very evident which way it is facing, right? You can look at that guy a mile off and tell where it's looking. And now I'm going to talk about some work that's out of Thomas Bunyar's lab. Loretto is the lead author on the paper, relatively recent. If one of these guys starts looking in a certain direction, the rest of the flock will check it out as well. They will synchronize. Their gaze. And you might think, oh, okay, that's because they're all saying to themselves, Charlie over there, he's seen something. What's Charlie looking at, right? You might think that they have some kind of mind reading involved in that kind of synchronization of head turn with these birds. And there's actually lots of other birds that will do that. They'll look up if the other guys in the flock are looking up, that kind of thing. Or maybe not. Maybe what they've learned over time, and just with trial and error or with instinct, it doesn't matter for our present purposes, is that if there's a sudden head turn by one of the guys, there's often a reward involved in turning your head to point in the same direction, right? So if I suddenly spy a food source, you know how it is with seagulls on the beach, you drop one little bit of a sandwich and you get one, and then all of a sudden there's 100 of them there or something like that. Yeah, maybe it's the same kind of phenomenon that they've discovered, that when one of them turns, it's often because there's either an attractive reward or a dangerous predator, something that has some value in attending to, and they have just mechanically learned to synchronize gaze without doing any mind reading at all. You might think, okay, it's going to be really hard to peel apart, which one of these hypotheses is it? There are some things you can start to do to try and peel these apart. So one of the things that you can do with these birds is you can check whether they are or are not sensitive to the presence of an opaque barrier. So this is where the experimental work gets very interesting. Suppose you have an enclosure and there's a partial wall coming down from the ceiling. And you get the birds to look at something. I think they actually used laser pointers, that these guys will find this fascinating and follow it around the way cats will, or the way maybe you will sometimes. So they would shine the laser pointer on a section of the wall that is going to separate them from birds on the other side. Now, a sign that the birds are really getting that Charlie is looking at that point would be that they would come around the barrier to check out what's Charlie looking at over here. A sign that they are just synchronizing head turn is when Charlie turns his head up there to that point, they just turn their heads up to a matching point. And these birds at least do that latter thing, which makes it look like they're not really getting what the perspective is revealing for the other bird. They are just superficially and in some shallow way turning their heads to face in the same direction. Not all birds are that dumb. There are some birds that are much smarter. I was going to talk about chimpanzees, But we've talked about them a little over the last few days, so I won't really go into them, other than to just say they're actually incredibly sophisticated at doing that trick of keeping track of which of their competitors are ignorant and which of their competitors are knowledgeable, and taking the action of the knowledgeable competitor way more seriously. Like, okay, that's a sign to where the treats are. Ravens are smarter than northern bald irises, or at least have better social cognitive cognition. They behave differently when they are caching or hiding their food, depending on whether they are or are not being observed. In Bunyar's 2016 experiment, they had an enclosure with a big window between the two sides of it. And in the sort of initial conditions, they manipulated whether another raven was or wasn't present on the other side of this enclosure when a bird was hiding food or caching food. And the raven would behave in a much more private way when there was another bird present, as opposed to when it was absent. In the next condition, they gave the raven first-hand personal, so there's a large window visible from both sides in that condition. But I think Bunyar was still concerned. Maybe what the ravens are really responding to is just the superficial cue of having another raven face and beak pointing at you when you're trying to cache your food. So in the next condition, they did something very much more interesting. They introduced the possibility of being seen, seeing or being seen, without the visual stimulus, or any other stimulus for that matter, of the presence of another bird. So they discovered that if you could close the window between these two birds, but you could retain the sound of the other bird on this side, whether through recording or having a live animal present, the bird on this side no longer acts in a private manner. They act as if they are, no one's looking at me now. And so they're not as secretive about where they cache their food. In the next series of conditions, what they did was they introduced little tiny peepholes that this raven was allowed to look through, and was allowed to look through and see actually not another raven, but a human being hiding food in different locations on the far side in here. This little peephole could be either open or closed. Then in the crucial experimental condition, you have a bird in here, and there's a peephole in the cage. And on the other side, you have just the sound of, pre-recorded sound of a raven. There wasn't actually a raven there, but they just manipulated whether that little peephole was open or closed. And whenever it was open, even though this bird isn't looking through and able to see a raven in there, there actually isn't even one. But whenever this is open, the raven acted in a more secretive manner, as if aware that it could be seen. So what the raven is doing at this point is, it seems, learning or generalizing from its own first-person perspective of the world onto the possibility of being seen or being witnessed by another agent. Now that's something that looks like genuine social cognition, right? It looks like you're taking your own first-person experience of the world and you're saying, wait a second, it could be like that for someone else looking in at me through this peephole. Okay, so we are capable of recognizing when other agents have false beliefs or misconceptions. Other primates seem not to be capable of that, but they do seem to be capable of having knowledge where or knowledge whether something is the case. So in this clever sequence of experiments, you have a target agent who is in that special position of having a view into two containers. The subject agent can't see the containers herself, but he can see that the other agent has a better view into them and can tell which one of them has a reward. And then either when the target agent is present, so they're both standing there, the target and the subject, and they watch those two containers being switched, or when the target agent walks out of the room and is absent for a moment, An interloper, an experimenter, switches the position of those two containers. Then, after the swap happens, the target agent reaches unsuccessfully for the container that presumably she takes to have the reward. What's the smart thing to do in this experiment? Well, obviously, if the target agent was present all the way through the switching, the target agent knows where the treat is, right? And so whichever container the target agent reaches for, you as a subject should reach for that container too. If, as was the case in this experimental setup, you actually have a better reach into the container. It's closer to you at the moment of choosing than it is to them. If they were away when that switch happens, they've got a misconception now when they're brought back about where the treat is. So whichever container they go for, you should go for the other one. Apes are able to do this first task. They're able to attribute knowing where. So that an ape doesn't initially know that the treat is in location A, or in bin number A, bin letter A, I should say. But the subject ape knows that the other agent knows which bin it's in, right? Seems like they can do that. They can't do the smart thing of keeping track of the misconception that human beings can do, but they can attribute some kind of knowing where. So that's a genuine differentiation in terms of whether the other party is knowledgeable or ignorant, and you as a subject can learn things about the world from watching the actions of creatures that you take to be more knowledgeable about it than you are. You can also think about how that would play out in pedagogy and so on. Are children watching the actions of their caregivers, partly with the thought that this caregiver knows more about reality than I do, so I could get somewhere by imitating that behavior. Okay, now for a very quick and shallow trip through predictive processing. And I have to say, I started thinking there might be something to this when I read Jakob Hovi's fascinating book, The Predictive Mind, which I recommend heartily to all of you. But I, of course, don't actually know. I don't know this material in very much depth at all. So if anyone wants to correct me at any point, please feel free. The basic idea behind the model is that we don't just, we're not immediately conscious of our sensory stimulation, and then we have to, from the bottom up, detect a series of features and infer the nature of reality. Actually, something kind of more counterintuitive is going on. Objects in the world do cause sensory stimulation in us, to be sure. And we've got a problem of trying to figure out the causes in the world from their effects on us. And this is a particularly difficult computational problem because there isn't a one-one mapping between a cause in the world, like this pen, and the effect that it has on you in terms of your sensory stimulation. It's problematic in two directions. One is that this very same object, the pen, can cause in you a great variety of different sensory stimulation, depending on whether you're looking at it from one angle or another angle, or which sensory modality you're picking it up with. Are you feeling it, hearing someone tap it? What conditions of illumination is it going through? This pen has so many possibilities in terms of the sensory stimulation it can trigger in you. And at the same time, especially if you're not fooling around with it and putting it through all the different modalities, suppose you just get a visual glimpse of it at a distance. There's lots of other things that could give you the same visual sensory stimulation as that pen right there, especially at a distance, especially in degraded conditions, right? I mean, one of the things that could give you exactly the same sensory stimulation as that pen is another pen just like that, right? So you have problems of numerical identity, but actually even things that aren't even pens, even like a little poster of a pen or something like that, could give you from where you're sitting the same sensory stimulation. Somehow you have to solve this problem. What's causing my sensory stimulation? Even though there isn't a simple mapping from one thing to another. So you have these bicycles here, and things that aren't bicycles could cause the same stimulation. And in fact, you don't even see the whole bicycle, right? You see some little part of it, the rest is occluded. You take yourself not just to be seeing like a bicycle part. You take yourself to be seeing the whole bike. The analogy that GOTTLOB keeps going back to for some reason, I find this a little grisly, involves a cat walking behind a fence. And he's like, well, yeah, you just catch a glimpse of it. It could be just cat slices and not a whole cat. You don't, that's not what you're really conscious of. You're conscious of an animal in a sense that you expect or anticipate there to be a full animal there. And you're not crazy to do that. You're not wrong to do it. So what you're actually aware of is your current best hypothesis of the world. And there's some complex process of unconscious inference through which your brain generates this hypothesis, and it's guided simultaneously by your prior beliefs and by error signals of the discrepancy between your predicted and your actual sensory stimulation. And in particular, you've got to do this kind of weird, delicate trade-off between relying on your prior beliefs. I have a prior belief that there are not just moving cat slices, walking around the world. You have to weigh that off against the current sensory stimulation that you are receiving, and how much weight you give to prior. Should I update my priors? Or should I fill in differently my prediction of what's going on in the world? How you balance that is really dependent on your flexible expectations of noise in the incoming sensory signal. So, one of the things that you will very naturally do is, if there's something that's a little hard to classify or something like that, you will start to act on your best current hypotheses of what is out there, and you'll look at it more closely. You'll try to increase the precision of your incoming sensory signal. There actually are conditions under which you could come to the judgment of, oh my goodness, horrific as it sounds, that is a bunch of cat slices, right? But it's probably not going to be on the basis of a casual glance. You probably have to go right up and look at it much more closely to, if you like, convince yourself that you've seen something so improbable. If you always expect the signal to be incredibly precise, you're going to actually end up kind of overfitting your data and losing predictive power. It's as if you expected that you could only ever encounter this pen from precisely the same angle and precisely the same conditions of illumination as you encounter it now. Right? If you're aware that things look different as conditions change, and in particular that, for example, as conditions deteriorate and you're looking at things under dim lighting or quickly, you may get signal that's not entirely as meaningful as a signal that you get when you're looking at things under bright lights and closely. Then you can be in trouble. You could try to fit every single one of your data points perfectly, as though it was giving you, perfect knowledge of what you're encountering. You're actually much better off discarding or somehow downweighting some of the signal as being the product of illusion, interference, shadow, and so forth. Okay. There's a whole bunch of different empirical evidence that Hovey brings forward for this hypothesis. I don't know if you've ever fooled around with binocular rivalry. If you happen to have on your person some red-green 3D glasses, you can actually experiment with this for yourself right now rather than just taking my word for it. But the way it goes is, if you present different stimuli to your two eyes, you're actually doing something which is very unusual. So usually in our encounters with reality, both of our eyes are looking at the same, shared reality. We don't have one reality that appears to the left eye and one reality that appears to the right eye. But we can artificially separate these things in the laboratory. You can give people visual signal for one eye, which is isolated from and different from the visual signal that you're giving to the other eye. Curiously, you don't experience something like the melding of these images that you will get now if you just look at this. You actually get alternation between seeing a face and seeing a building. So what you will get is you'll have a conscious experience of the face for a while, and then it'll suddenly pop over and you'll have conscious experience of the house, and then it'll go back to this. It's really really remarkable and really disturbing. You can allocate your attention to one image or the other. And in fact, that's something you can do even with this fused image, even this image I'm, of course, presenting to both of your eyes at the same time, so you're not quite getting it. But if you look at this, if you decide consciously and deliberately to trace the woman's face, really focus on it, follow around the contours, that will pop out as being much more consciously available. If you stop doing that and instead look at the roof line, look at the windows, focus on actively exploring the house, what you're doing is you're actually boosting the precision of that signal. So you're actively engaging with that side of it, and that pops it up to consciousness. I'm going to get back to epistemology, I swear. This is kind of the last slide on the general model. So in perception, what you've got is you've got a bunch of low-level regularities about edges, surfaces, contours, shadows, transformations that happen as something is translated and rotated through space and moved through different conditions of illumination. And those low-level regularities apply to everything. They apply to pens and hands and cats and bicycles, as well as to agents. At the same time, further up in the great causal hierarchy of the world, there are some deeper causes. So there is, the same person who is appearing over time to you in various presentations and under various conditions of illumination. That's a deeper cause. It has a perspective invariant, and it has lasting features. Actually, even the pen has a lot of perspective invariant lasting features, which you posit as being present. And we go back and forth between updating from one side and updating from the other. The same sensory stimulation, if you take it in isolation, is often ambiguous. And this is just a product of that it's not one-one kind of problem that I mentioned at the very beginning. So if you look at this very naively, it's actually kind of hard to see it very naively, at least for me at this point, but you may, if you're normal, you may see this side as convex and that side as concave. I don't know, did you get it that way? Does it feel like that to you maybe first glance? This doesn't always work. It actually works better on the printed page than it does illuminated on a screen. There's a theory behind that, which is that we have a very high prior probability that illumination tends to be from above. Exactly the same sensory stimulation arises as, actually, illumination's from overhead, I should say. If you turn your head upside down, you can get it to reverse, which is kind of fun. The very same sensory stimulation can arise if you have a convex object lit from above and a concave object lit from below. So if you want to try seeing this as concave, imagine the floodlights shining up from the bottom into this concavity. If you start really forcing yourself to imagine this, if you're good at it, you can start seeing that as concave. You can see this as convex. Look, there it is. The lights are shining on it. It's bulging out there. You can actually deliberately and mentally change it. It's a little harder to change. Some of the classic things you can change quite easily are those bistable figures like the Necker cube. You can see first one facet and then the other as forward, but you can even do that for this kind of 3D resolution. Interestingly, if you encounter a sensory stimulus of this character, whether in the lab or in the wild, you don't experience it as being something that is ambiguous, as being something that has a 0.97 probability of being convex and lit from above, and at the same time, a 0.3 probability of being concave and lit from below. You don't experience that ambiguity. You experience it as resolved one way or another. And it's an interesting question why we experience things consciously without the ambiguity. The theory that Javi is guided by, Javi and his friends, is that consciousness presents us with a unique ambiguity-resolving model of the world because it has to guide action. If you were to reach out and touch this thing, you perform a different reach if it's convex versus concave. You have to reach further, right? When you actually have to act, when you're walking along and there's a fork in the road and you need to get home, you can't send like 75% of your body down this side and 25% the other, right? You've got You've got to make a choice. You've got to resolve it. Of course, we as human beings can start engaging in reflective cognition and think of fancier ways to improve our cognitive predicament. But the basic idea is that action has to be determinate, and that's why those ambiguities get resolved. Action itself in the predictive processing model is understood in many ways as the reciprocal of perception, but actually in some ways in a way that's very similar to the way perception is understood. So the mandate to minimize prediction error governs action as well as perception. When you form a motor intention, one of the things that you are doing, if I form the intention to reach, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm constructing a forward model of the expected sensory consequences of that action. So it's not like I reach my hand and it's like, oh my God, where did that thing come from, right? I anticipate that it's going to head along a certain trajectory. And then I'm actually moving in such a way as to make that prediction true. To minimize error in the prediction error, so minimize deviation in the model. Now, we can actively test our perceptual hypothesis about reality by shifting our gaze, moving our bodies. This switch from sort of passive to active inference is absolutely crucial in inferring what causes actually exist out there in the world. Okay, now states of mind actually have an interesting character in this model. First, states of mind are causes. I'm caused to act by my goal states, my desires, my states of ignorance or knowledge. States of mind are relatively high-level causes. So if I know that the cue ball has been sunk into the far pocket, I can get it right now. I can wait a minute. I can have a conversational digression before I reach it. They exercise their causal powers over larger time scales. If your state is a career goal, that mental state might exercise its causal power over you for years, right, as you go through like an extended education and in multiple subtle ways. One of the distinctive features of modeling agents versus modeling inanimate reality is that they can model you back. So as I interact with this pen, I don't expect its actions to be sort of contingent on what it sees of me or it's seeing me coming. If an agent that I am interacting with is something I take to be sentient, even a mouse, I can act towards it, but I will be anticipating there's going to be maybe some kind of complicated, nonlinear function between my actions and its actions. If it sees me coming, it's going to run, right? So it might be a little bit more tentative with it. It's modeling me right back. That pen doesn't see me coming. I don't have to worry about that. If the agent that I'm interacting with is not just sentient, but also capable of mental state attribution, if it's smart, if it's onto me, then I can expect to have even more delicate interactions with it, right? So a mouse might not be in that category, but another person would. That as I approach them, I expect them to model me, and I expect them to, in a sense, model the way I'm modeling me or recognize the way that I'm modeling me. For this idea of social cognition as causal inference, there's again a bunch of interesting evidence. One piece of evidence that Hovey and Palmer in a 2014 paper focus on is the relation between autism spectrum deficit in social cognition and broader sensory issues faced by people with autism spectrum disorder. So one characteristic that I've already mentioned about the signal from mental states is that they're noisy, right? So unlike the billiard balls that click together in a clean and precise fashion, the relationship between, for example, a mental state of happiness and an outward expression is really quite diverse and variable. How much am I going to smile if I'm happy? Am I going to be happy and pretend not to be? Are you going to hear some slight changes in my voice? Could I pretend to be happy when I'm not feeling happy inside? Man, it's complicated, right? Facial expressions certainly are some kind of signal of emotion, but they're a fairly noisy and hard to read signal. Individuals with autism spectrum disorder exhibit relatively inflexible preference for high precision signals. So individuals with autism spectrum disorder are often extremely good at cognitive tasks involving precise low-level regularities, detection of small geometrical patterns and little shifts. When you turn the faces of a Rubik's Cube, there are a bunch of very precisely calculable relationships that emerge from that. And in that way, it's very much unlike. The relationship between the turn of the cube and the resulting face is very much unlike the relationship between a messy emotion and the resulting face of the person, right? And it's for this reason, Hovey and Palmer argue that it's harder for individuals with autism spectrum disorder to infer mental states. So they are more inclined to engage in active, if you like, oversampling of surface details of the sensory landscape, looking for small patterns, maybe disturbed by peculiar and unpredictable anomalies, less willing to just ascend right up that causal hierarchy and update their priors and jump to conclusions about messy underlying mental states that could be driving the little changes that they are seeing in the world. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite of that. It's kind of the other end of the spectrum, that schizophrenics will over-attribute very high-level causes, as it were, jumping to conclusions, seeing even the clouds that are blowing past in the street as angry, as agentive, as speaking to them, right? So that's sort of the other end of this kind of disorder. There's a common cause explanation in this framework for both sides. Okay, I've been in the other lectures talking quite a bit about what joint attention is, right? And that's something that's uniquely human. Other primates don't have it. When I initiate joint attention with another person, I'm not just looking at where they're looking. Like, oh yeah, he's looking now that I've mentioned it so many times, at that pen. I'm looking there too. When I initiate joint attention with another person, I'm actually acting on them. I'm actively directing their gaze towards the object. And that's something that we as human beings do all the time. We do it visually. There's actually other ways of generating joint attention other than the visual, but the visual is the easiest one to put up on a PowerPoint, so I'll do this. I want to look at this piece of art together with you. Hey, look at that. And I'll glance back to see if my effort at initiating joint attention has actually succeeded or not. Again, we remember from this morning the data that Tomasello is so taken by with his Koyabashi study of the human eye as being spectacularly indicative among all the animals of exactly which direction it's pointed in, because we have that high contrast white sclera around the iris. So we're really sharing our mental states with each other. Okay. So here's a very strange sounding suggestion. Maybe it's true. I hope it's true. I think Patrick and I were talking earlier about the possibility that sometimes we say things in philosophy and we're not entirely sure that they're right. But I think something in this neighborhood may be right. If you think about how joint attention works, maybe for just a moment, my agency isn't just governing my own body the way that it does when I reach my hand. I had this sort of motor command. There was an expected sensory consequence of that action. I expect to see my hand moving in a certain way. If the action starts to fail, if I start to encounter resistance, I will try to get it back on course in order to succeed in grasping in the direction that I want it. And I am watching what happens as a source of feedback on the successful execution of that action. if you think about how joint attention works, maybe my agency isn't just governing my own perceptual attention, but also the other person's. That if I look at somebody and try to look at an object and glance and see if they're looking at it as well, what I'm doing is I'm causing them to model the world in a certain way. I've actually, I move my own eye towards the object, but because we're social creatures of the kind that we are, I can move other people's eyes towards that object as well. So I can look at their eyes, and that's actually a success signal of how my action is turning out. So my agency actually controls the way that they're looking too. So I'm causing them to model and taking them to be modeling my perceptual attention in the same way. So there's a sort of mutuality in eye contact. It's like if I can see you, I know you can see me, right? If I can see that you're looking at a certain object and I've directed your attention there and I look to see that my effort at acting has actually extended also to manipulation of your perceptual attention, then I can take us to be on the same page. Okay, why go all the way to attributing knowledge? It's weird that I'm thinking, yeah, we both see that the object is there, as opposed to saying, well, there's a high probability that my visual stimulus is similar to his or something like that. We've got this concept of belief. We, alone among the animals, can keep track of each other's misconceptions as well as the cases in which we get things right. Why don't we just experience others as highly likely to have true beliefs? How does it help us to make this bolder move of attributing knowledge? Well, I think taking another person to know does two things. First, it guides your action with respect to that person, and it also guides your action with respect to the world. This is especially the case if you take them to know something that you don't yet know. I don't know where the treat is, but I know that he does. I'm going to follow it. You're actually seeing that agent as a reflection of the world. You could always, if you want, make the weaker prediction that the agent only has a belief or the agent only has a high credence. But I think this would be doing something like overfitting the data, right? So that you are trying to go just on the basis of this very slim scrap of data that you've got. You're trying to stick to the most conservative possible prediction, but that undercuts the predictive value of the model that you are trying to construct. If you make the stronger or bolder attribution, you actually gain in predictive power. If I think that, I mean, it's silly because it's an illusion, but if I think that this is actually a convex object, I predict that it will feel a certain way when I touch it, and I can act on that and check whether that prediction is correct. And that's something that can give me more of a handle into dealing with the world. Whereas if I'm just looking at this thing and thinking, well, could be a pen, could be a poster that looks like a pen, I could be a brain in a vat and they're about to pull the plug. This is not really guiding my action, right? I may be making a much more conservative hypothesis about how the world is, but there are costs to that. Okay, so one thing you might be hearing now is you might be thinking, oh, okay, so she's just saying anytime you've got a high probability outcome, you got to just gun it and say, scrap 99%, we're going 100. And that's not what we do because of, among other things, our old friend, the lottery paradox. So this is sort of a deep feature and empirically tested and everything of how we attribute knowledge. Let's imagine for a moment that you have a lottery ticket in a fair 1 in a million lottery. The draw has just been held, but the winner has not been announced. I actually have a friend back in North America who buys every one of her epistemology class students a lottery ticket for this class, and she just like hands them out at the beginning of class. It's like, okay, look at your ticket. Might be a winner. Now, let's say the draw has just been held, but the winner hasn't yet been announced. Do you know that your ticket is a losing ticket? Here's one thing you can do very easily. You can say, the rational credence in this proposition is 0.999999. Why don't I just say, yes, I know that this ticket has lost? Ooh, that feels kind of wrong, doesn't it? Like, among other things, it feels wrong because knowledge is supposed to be a state of mind you can have only towards the truths. And you can have this kind of symmetry reasoning. You can say, but hey, wait a minute. If everybody who has a ticket in this lottery knows that their ticket is lost, that's getting weird. Or wait, the one person who actually is the lucky winner doesn't know and the rest of us do. This is getting really strange. But notice something special about this case. This is a case in which you are given a very precise rational expectation of the variance. So it's like one of these very crucial things in the predictive processing framework that we're actually flexible in terms of how much precision we're expecting in terms of the incoming sensory signal. This kind of case is very special because I'm giving you a really stipulated, scripted rule. There is a precise mathematical formula that you can apply in this case to see exactly what the odds are of losing. And that makes it actually very different from our real-world encounters with physical objects in perception. Okay, wait a minute. What are these real-world encounters? So I'm going to take for a moment not a case of perceptual knowledge, but a case of testimonial knowledge, because in a sense that's simpler. I'm not a skeptic about testimonial knowledge. And in ordinary life, we're not typically skeptics about testimonial knowledge. And I'll give you an example of this. Okay, so here's a question. Does anybody know whether David Bowie is still alive? Like, this is sad, and I hope I'm not breaking news to anybody, but yeah, he's dead, right? And that's something we take ourselves to know, at least if we're not in an epistemology class getting all self-conscious about it all of a sudden. And here's a little harsher question, like, are you actually in a state of mind with respect to that fact such that it's essential to being in your state of mind right now that what you judge to be the case is in fact true? And how you can start like playing with alternative scenarios like, crap, what if he was just getting sick of the fame and kind of like faked it? And wait, where did I even learn that David Bowie had died? Like, wasn't that TMZ or I don't know, like my shameful internet browsing habits. Maybe I don't know this, right? So you can start thinking, maybe that attribution of knowledge was just like the case in which we got sloppy and we said, 99%, call it 100. And you might think, okay, perception in particular, in order for someone to see that P is the case, in order for you to see that the pen is on the table, as opposed to just having maybe like a pen hallucination or something like that, has to be the case that P is true. So can your fallible perceptual systems actually deliver that kind of has to be the case relationship? From the first person perspective, might feel like, uh-oh, seeming to see that there's a pen there is just exactly like seeing that there's a pen there, right? From the first person perspective, really, really hard to peel those things apart. If we step out to the third person perspective, and you imagine sort of like, yeah, looking down on somebody's visual cortex from what we were calling the bird's eye perspective, or maybe we're going to go right ahead and call it the God's eye perspective, and imagining what's going on in the brain and what's going on in the world, it looks like we really have to think there is a difference between hallucinating that there's a pen there and seeing that there's a pen there, right? But it's not a difference which is just explicable in terms of activity in the visual cortex, right? It's a difference which actually incorporates this whole relationship between the external state of affairs and what's going on in the brain. So factive mental states extend beyond the barrier of the agent. They involve a relationship between the subject and the world. I think if we do have the right kind of causal sensitivity to features of the world, it can put us as agents into factive mental states. So here's a question you might have if you're sort of attracted to philosophical skepticism. This is actually a quite common perspective in contemporary epistemology. I think it's wrong. So Jim Pryor has the thought, this is from the beginning of his paper, The Skeptic and the Dogmatist. Consider the skeptic about the external world. Let's straight away concede to such a skeptic that perception gives us no conclusive or certain knowledge about our surroundings. Our perceptual justification for beliefs about our surroundings, always defeasible. There are always possible improvements in our epistemic state which would no longer support those beliefs. There's a way of looking at this that's going to make it seem compelling, but I think ultimately it's wrong. It looks compelling if you kind of think about it just from the first-person perspective. So imagine you're in a situation in the laboratory in real life where you look at what seems to be a convex shape lit from above, you probably can imagine from the first person perspective improvements in your epistemic state which would no longer support your judgment. So you can imagine discovering, oh wow, this thing is lit from below. Or even better, you can imagine discovering that, yeah, you know what guys, this is not an object at all, it's just a video projection. There's nothing there that is convex, right? That would be an improvement in your epistemic state. Just think about that from the first person perspective. Because from the first person perspective, take anything that you actually believe, you can kind of toy with imagining that the world is different from that. What about a third person perspective? Let's take someone who's actually in the room, like Thomas, who's actually looking at this pen. And can we imagine an improvement in his epistemic perspective where he's not going to be able to support the judgment that there's a pen on the table, right? We can imagine giving him a lot of misleading evidence that leads him to retract his judgment that there's a pen. That's not an improvement in his epistemic state, though. We could tell Tina, oh, Tina, by the way, floodlights from below, and she stops even seeing it as convex. She starts seeing it as concave. Not an improvement in her epistemic state, though. She's not better matching the world. So you might think, actually, there was a weird way in which she did, initially, at her first glance, have knowledge, even though later it dissolved when she started thinking about the world in a different way. I'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow morning. But we've got this sort of basic idea that maybe you could have states of mind which actually really do lock onto the truth. If you do, that's true not just in virtue of the inner arrangement of your sensory faculties, but it's true in virtue of your relationship with that outer world. So if Tina really is looking at a convex shape and she judges it to be convex, if she's allowed to get up and touch it and move around it, all she's going to get, if that really is a convex thing, is more confirmation that it's convex. Just like if Thomas comes up and starts interacting with this pen, all he's going to get is more confirmation that he was right. He knew it was a pen. So if you actually did hear that David Bowie died from some chain of transmission which was ultimately anchored in somebody who knew the fact, a coroner, maybe a reliable reporter who spoke to that coroner, who witnessed the presence of that dead body, then even if you don't remember who it was who told you this thing, as long as the causal chain of transmission appropriately links you to the fact, you could have knowledge now. So what matters is the actual genesis of your judgment, not whether you can give, right now, an argumentative defense of your mindset to someone who walks in and starts doubting. So in common knowledge, what you're doing in directing your attention towards the object is a reflection of what the other person is doing. So each of you is treating the other like a public unique signal of coordination. Sometimes your attempts at that might fail. You might think that you've got common joined attention with somebody else when you don't. But that doesn't have to undermine the cases in which it succeeds. So we've got, I think, these fact and mental states. They get us in touch with reality, even though we don't always have the God's eye perspective on how it is that they're doing this. To the extent that others can share their knowledge with us, that task is socially shared. So you learn about the world by seeing how other people react about it. And actually, we also learn about ourselves and our own epistemic states by seeing how people react to us and how they react to our epistemic states, in particular our claims to know various things about reality. Thank you. Are the windows in this room openable? Because it feels actually really warm to me. I don't know whether that's just them speaking, but if there's a possibility of more oxygen, I'd be welcome.
Great. Patrick, this question?
Yeah, so really cool talk. I kind of agree with pretty much all of it. But I have a question about the fit argument.
I feel like that's always the prelude to a devastating question. But yeah, continue.
So it's the fitting argument. So we should go for states like knowledge when we're doing it because on the whole it will end up fitting better and we'll have more predictive power or things will work better in the end.
Yeah.
So that seems cool. But then what about for this individual case in which I'm figuring out whether or not I should attribute belief or knowledge in this one case? So yeah, it's true, on the whole I should be going with knowledge, but now I'm interested in just one case where now I'm going to like really look at the data and potentially opt for the higher fitting thing because, well, this is one particular case. And it seems like I could potentially reason that way for any given case that I am. So like, well, on the whole, I should be going for knowledge. But right now, hey, I have all this data that potentially allows me to overfit.
So one of the things that you could start doing is you could start taking your epistemic state itself as a topic of inquiry. And then you're essentially asking, ooh, do I know that I know this, right? But knowing that you know is actually a higher epistemic status than simply knowing that something's the case. So there's a sense in which if you focus too hard, you can start changing the topic. You can change the topic from, is this apparent, to, wait a second, what is the proper epistemic relationship between this agent and that object? That's actually a much more complicated question, and you might be in a worse epistemic position on that more complicated question than you were on just, what's that over there, right? And when you say, oh, let's just take this one case in isolation, the idea behind the predictive processing framework is that, that's actually not a great idea, right? That you always have to be leaning on your priors to intelligently interpret what you're encountering right now. Otherwise you're stuck in the position of the person who's like encountering somebody who maybe just looks a tiny bit different today than the way that they looked yesterday. A tiny bit of a haircut or something like that. And you're like, well, this could be an identical twin with a slight difference, or it could be the same person. Hard to say, right? Like if you overthink the case, trying to zero in on the present instant, one of the things you're losing is you're losing the benefit of your accumulated track record of knowledge over the past, including your track record of encountering facted mental states as well as non-facted mental states in yourself and in other people, right? So it's like just one of these cases. So it's the same like when you're listening to the news, right? You could hear the report that, you know, Prince has died or something like that. You kind of have a choice if you want to think about it. You could be like, oh man, that's so sad. Or you could be like, well, that's what that guy thinks, right? But if you go through your whole life like, well, that's what that guy thinks. It looks like a pen from this side, but it might not be one. So even though I need to sign a check, I'm not going to touch it, right? Could be a bomb. Then your possibilities of action are really sort of horribly limited. Now I know this is sounding like, oh God, she's giving some kind of like pragmatic defense of knowledge attribution, and all I can say is I wish it didn't sound that way. And I don't think it has to be that way in the end. Like I think you could in the end give a properly and fully epistemic defense of what you're doing, that there's just features of the world that you are missing if you always make the more cautious attribution. But I think that would take quite a bit more work.
Thomas? Yes, thanks. So, did I understand you correctly that your suggestion is that the difference between, I don't know, the perception case or the testimony case and the lottery case is that in the lottery case we actually know the probabilities, whereas in case of perception or testimony we don't? Because it doesn't sound quite right, because I can easily imagine a case where I enter a lottery, I buy a ticket, but I have genuinely no idea what the probabilities of me winning are. So it could be 1 out of 300, it could be 1 out of 300 million, and I would still not think that I know, right? Because and it seems to be that it has to be some sort of different mechanism that distinguishes.
Yes, right. That's a very good point. So there still are certain things you know about it in virtue of it being a lottery ticket. You know that there is some kind of process of chance governing the outcome, right? I think there actually can be cases in which you have a lottery ticket and you know that you're not going to win. So the classic cases in literature are cases in which you learn that someone corrupt has been rigging the lottery so that only members of the lottery commission are winning these tickets at this point. Right. So that's not, exactly. So that's not That's not a lottery in the standard sense. It's sort of built into the concept of a lottery, that there is a precise and probabilistic way of thinking about this outcome that we can just avail ourselves of. It's stipulated. It's stipulated as if it's known, right? And it's interesting that you take those those stipulations on board. So you're just given a much more precise way of modeling that situation. You're able to think about it reflectively in a certain way, and you're not typically supplied with that in the ordinary perceptual and testimonial cases. What you're supplied with in the ordinary perceptual and testimonial cases is just something that's actually much more complicated, having to do with your own track record of perception and testimony.
I mean, so the idea would be then that I know that there is a precise prior probability. I don't know what it is, but in any given lottery, it exists.
Yeah.
Whereas in case of testimonial knowledge, that's not the case.
Right.
You could think of a person who kind of has this statistical information that that people tend to make mistaken judgments about reliable testifiers in precisely 1 out of 1,000 times or something like that. And you would, so it seems that there's also objectively a prior sort of probability there as well. It's just not so easily known or something like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on how you're individuating the method of belief formation in these cases. Is the method of belief formation just like listening to what someone says? Is the method of belief formation just having sensory stimulation which is, ultimately ambiguous between the real presence of a pen and a pen facade? Or is the method of belief formation itself being individuated kind of in success terms, so that something actually only really counts as testimonial knowledge acquisition if it has that success structure of learning from somebody who knows? If you learn a fact from somebody who knows, because knowledge is factive, whatever you learn from a sincere speaker who knows has to be true. So it's just a kind of a question of how you're individuating these structures. I'll say more about it tomorrow morning. I don't know if it'll help, but.
Okay, Alex?
I'm wondering about the relationship between where you end up at the end of the talk and the set of experiments that you were talking about at the beginning.
Okay.
So one of those experiments was where you have this facade, this block at the top, and then one bird's looking at the other, and there's a question of whether they try to reach around to the other side to see what the bird's looking at, or if it's looking the same. So that kind of makes it look as though the thing that the birds are being tested for is their ability to adopt the perspective of the other bird in some way, and that they're not doing that. But the focus of knowledge that you're getting at the end of the talk is kind of using other people to figure out stuff about the world. But there's less emphasis on the perspective that person has on the world, and more interested in like the world in itself that you can get at from learning from other people. And I wondered whether there's, so how should I understand the relationship between the kind of the mental states that are being examined in the experiments at the beginning and the kind of mental state that you're talking about at the end, where it's knowledge, but knowledge in this social role, in the social capacity?
So there actually is, even in the case of testimonial knowledge transmission, a crucial moment of me representing something about the perspective of the trusted other, right? That I have to take it to be the case. If they're giving me something which is news to me, I have to be taking it to be the case that they are either directly or indirectly themselves latched onto the fact that they have the right kind of relationship to the truth. Seeing them as being in that privileged position, as having a clear line of sight into the bin, is an essential part of me taking their testimony on board as knowledge for me.
Right. Okay. So I'm now thinking about this.
So it's not just that I'm taking what they say as true. Sometimes you can take what someone says as true without seeing them as knowing. If you've got this kind of like weird situation of inference, you know, like that person is always wrong about these things, but I know that the boxes have been switched, so I can actually infer that the answer is, actually the answer is the one that they're giving, but they don't know that it is. That's a kind of complicated inferential structure that I'm pinning in there. It's different when you just take someone's word for something. You have to be positioning them as a knower in order to do that. It's a bit weird. It's sort of like this. You can think of the state of knowing that P is the case. If someone's in that position, then the relationship between their knowledge that P is the case and P itself is like the relationship between cause and effect, right? It's that kind of entailment relationship. And it's weird because we usually think of epistemic mental states the other way around. The fact that P is what causes, as an effect, someone to believe that P. But structurally, there seems to be kind of an inversion, right? But that is kind of like what you're trying to do. When you try to, as it were, infer a hidden cause for your sensory stimulation, right? You're trying to get yourself in a position where your state of mind is such that the world is going to turn out the way your state of mind says that it is, right? So if my state of mind is knowing that this thing is convex, as I step to it and reach out and start to grab it, it's as though my mind were making it so that I will find the object to be the way that I anticipated it to be. And I can absolutely get myself into that state if I'm lucky enough to be in the right, I've got my maybe inherently ambiguous sliver of sensory stimulation from the object. If it is the right kind of object, and my sensory faculties are working in the right way, then yeah, I can actually successfully be in that state of mind where things are going to turn out the way that I see them as turning out. So that's what it is to be knowledgeable.
So the kind of so the idea that attributing beliefs only and avoiding knowledge is a version of overfitting.
Yeah. So it would be like I'm just looking at these little agents and thinking, well, what are they going to do, detached from all questions of what's going on in the reality around them? If I can see them as knowers, then I see them as reflecting the reality around them. And I think we actually do typically reflect the reality around us, right? We do typically respond appropriately to the presence of open doors and flights of stairs and dangerous situations on the highway ahead of us. I'm not wrong if I put on the brakes when I see everyone else do that up ahead.
That's true. This is like maybe kind of a fault to Thomas, but I'm curious about, so say in cases where, I don't know, maybe I'm like unfortunate to know that in eyewitness testimony, like most people or pretty much all people are like only 60% reliable or something like that. So I'm in a position where antecedently I have these prior background beliefs about the reliability of perception in certain cases and testimony on behalf of other people when they do that. So if I have that background belief and I encounter someone who's giving me eyewitness testimony, should I then end up treat it like a lottery case? Where
Absolutely.
I then,
Absolutely. Okay. Yes. So if you, that's not overfitting anymore, right? So if you recognize that you are in this sort of interesting subclass of cases where people are unreliable, say they start testifying to you about their recovered memories of childhood satanic abuse, right? And you know the whole story about how those furious memories are implanted through bad psychotherapy. You'll know not to take that at face value. That's not our ordinary epistemic position with respect to each other's tellings. Like, we are socially epistemically cooperative. We know a huge amount of what we know secondhand. Yeah, I've never been to Antarctica, but I believe it's there. In fact, I know it's there, right? From other people's reports, and just a huge amount of what's going on around me in the world. Is based on trust and not necessarily epistemically the worse for that. Now there are some zones, and these zones might be actually expanding right now because of perverse structures that are taking shape within social media in particular. There are some zones in which we are epistemically compromised, and there are definitely some zones in which we're epistemically compromised in ways that we have yet to fully master.
Yeah, so I could just.
Yeah.
The kind of follow-up is, I'm curious, like in this type of framework, what type of what's it like telling me what I should do in cases? So is it like, if I don't have any like type of a statistical evidence to the contrary or strong type of evidence that these might be situations in which like people are wrong in their attributions of knowledge or belief states, if in absence of that I should go and like, yeah, knowledge is fine. And so this is kind of like getting back to that like meta question.
Yeah, I think it's generally, like, you have a choice. You could, if you want, pursue unbounded precision and just try to be ultimately as cautious as you possibly can in everything. You start calculating the stats, and wait, what are you going to use? Excel? A calculator? Do you trust what it's even telling you, right? Okay, forget that. I'll go by hand. Wait a minute. I know that my mental arithmetic has, limited reliability. You can, if you like, absolutely paralyze yourself by refusing to take any one state, either your own or anybody else's, as indicative of reality. That would be kind of a problem. The question is, of course, striking a good balance between what you're going to trust and accept, whether that's what other scientists are telling you, what other members of your epistemic community are telling you, what your devices are telling you. You have a very kind of complicated balance between accepting things and exercising caution or increasing caution. In a free society, I guess there's going to be a distribution between different individuals who are more risk-taking and more risk-averse as far as their epistemic practices are concerned, and that's probably a good thing that that's distributed, in society. So you can have people who give kind of, creative and speculative theories, and you can have people who are giving very cautious and exact theories. Presumably there'll be some kind of balance, which we're going to figure out over time. And figuring out exactly what that balance is going to be like is going to be a matter of getting to know more and more about our own psychology, but also more and more about regularities in the world. And we can test the hypotheses that we're coming up with by trying to act on them and seeing how that turns out. So, like, if you start wondering, is David Bowie really alive? Well, I guess you can go start, like, researching these questions.
Thank you very much for your very clear talk. I'm just thinking to come back. We had a talk about imagination, and I was just thinking whether this could also, in some sense, have relationship with your talk, when you have like a claim like active mental states get us in touch with reality. Is it excluding that also fictive mental states could also get our touch in reality? You had this difference between knowledge and belief. For example, this slide where the boxes, we do not know actually whether what is in it. And for example, saying also about animals, how they react and what they can have what kind of whether they can have knowledge or belief. And I was just thinking whether that could be also a place for just experimenting with imagination, or also, what is for animals very important, also like memory or remembering, because both like imagination, for example, can be about like make-believe that there is something in the box. Does it play a role also that one is able to imagine that in this box is the cake, for example? And again, when this is, when you go on with this, the question is also what sort of imagination? Is it like propositional, that just make-believe that there is a cake, or there is an image of a cake, that you can vividly have you do not perceive it, but you have an image of a cake. You actually, and for that, do you have to have a knowledge of how cake looks like, because you cannot otherwise, or for a dog, that there is some kind of bone in the box and things like this. Is this totally on a different line of thought, or could this go into it?
Not at all. Actually, I do think that the exercise of the imagination is something that can get us in touch with reality. One of my graduate students, Daniel Moreau, is actually writing a thesis on this very topic. So I've been thinking a lot about it in connection with his work. One of the ways in which I think exercises of the imagination can get us in touch with reality is that they can help us explore features of our existing causal model of regularities in our environment So we can think about hypothetical situations and imagine or simulate what would happen if those hypothetical situations were to obtain. We do this all the time in action planning when we're deliberating between two courses of action. We try to imagine as concretely as we can one of the possibilities for action and think about what would follow from it. And sometimes you can recognize, oh my goodness, no, that would be a disaster. She would be very upset if I did that. I'm not going to do that. And you are actually bringing to light certain aspects of your prior existing knowledge of causal structure, causal regularities. You're bringing it up to light, bringing it to consciousness. You can also maybe gain new knowledge in various interesting ways through the exercise of the imagination. So you can imagine, for example, particular general tendencies that you're aware of as applied to a particular object that you now encounter. And from that you can gain knowledge of what would happen to that object if you were to subject it to various pressures or various tests. And yeah, thought experiments. Like you think of Galileo's experiments conducted in the arena of the mind with dropping the balls from the tower. Those I think could give you knowledge, could give you specifically the knowledge that the Aristotelian theory of motion entails something contradictory there. So then it can't be right, and that's stuff.
But then it is propositional, isn't it? When it is just like thought experiments, it's propositional. Just imagine that is
yeah,
a cake in it.
I think it's possible that
images. Is it important to have an image of a cake also?
Well, I think maybe you can get, but I think it's an open question whether images are themselves vehicles of propositional knowledge. And I think maybe you can get other kinds of knowledge, maybe even by testing your emotional reaction to different possible actions that you're rehearsing in your imagination.
Who doesn't have a follow-up? Okay, it's been a long day, so let's finish here.
Thank you.